So we're going to get straight into the analysis today because so much has happened. There's so much to go through. But one of the big things, it seems like, Mark Twain's famous quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme a lot. We're talking about concussion protocols again. Junior Firpo this weekend, we're watching the game. First half, he clattered with Ilamezier, and then in the second half, he had to come off. Ben, can you kind of clear up the situation there? Has he got concussion? Is he going to have to go through the concussion protocol now?
I mean, quite possibly. It's something, we get a lot of questions levied at us. Why did the medical department or club doctors, those who are assessing him on the pitch, why wasn't he removed following that collision with teammate Meslier at that point? Given the severity of potentially head injuries and the consequences of a secondary impact, which is the big worry, then no chances should be taken. But we never know what's actually happening on the pitch, the conversations that have went on. What we do know is that, I never for one moment doubt that any member of a medical team, a medical practitioner, would go onto that pitch without the best interest of that player, being paramount to any decision-making process. I don't question that there's anybody thinking about putting the team ahead of that player's health, not in the modern game. What we need to do is, we maybe need that independent assessment and guidelines. We also need more time to assess players, but also as well, those reactions, those indications that a player may have suffered a head trauma, concussion, those can be delayed. So at that moment in time, the player, if there's nothing overtly obvious in terms of their mannerisms, in terms of, how they're responding to questions, in terms of their body language and how they're acting, and if the player's saying they're absolutely fine and there's nothing there to tell you otherwise, then, the medical team and those assessing him sometimes just have to make that, that snap judgment decision and say, well, actually, maybe, it is quite possible for a player just to suffer a head injury and not always be concussed, no matter how bad it may initially look.
Well, let's take it almost a step back, go into analysing what is a concussion, because, we're talking about it so much. It is described as such a danger. But Raj, can you explain what is a concussion and why it poses such a danger, not just to athletes in general, but to everybody?
Yeah, I mean, the medical term for a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury, MTBI. So essentially, you're having some damage within your brain, which then leads to a whole cascade of events. And so in the end, the brain is the most vital function of the body, right? So, and when that's damaged, it's going to lead to a lot of different issues. And so, in the end, that's really why concussions are so dangerous, because you're dealing with kind of the overlying most important thing in your body, which tends to dictate everything else as well. And so, going to Ben's point about assessment, I think providers are put into a bad spot because it's almost impossible to assess for a concussion on the pitch. It's very, very bright. You have a lot of crowd noise. There's so many distractions, right? Players' baseline testing is not done in these conditions. And therefore, how can you compare testing to a baseline if it's not done in the same conditions? The problem is those tests can take up to 10 minutes. And so which manager is going to allow a player to go off and be under, and be at 10 men for a 10-minute period? Good luck with that one. And so there has to be some temporary substitute rule or something put in place if you're ever going to have that. But that's a pretty big jump, especially in the Premier League, where they won't even allow 5 subs. You've seen how much of an issue that is. So now imagine trying to put in a 10-minute temporary substitute rule. I don't know where you would even start with that. So the assessment in and of itself is very difficult. And that's why, to Ben's point, you're making snap decisions based on very, very obscure indicators about an injury that's already very obscure. So it makes it really, really difficult.
And just to add to the difficulty there, Ben has described that some of the symptoms don't even come about, but also concussion. Am I right in saying this, Raj? It doesn't always have to involve a blow to the head either. You can get it from a fast impact situation where your body's coming to stop, maybe a whiplash situation. It's not even a concussion just to situations that you might assume that they are. Isn't that right, Raj?
Yeah, any sudden head movement like a whiplash is something called a coup contra coup injury with the brain, where the brain actually hits the skull and causes damage. And so it doesn't have to be at all from your head hitting the ground.
So kind of continuing this then, you've both said that there's something wrong with the rules, and just kind of analysing what the rules have been. It was last season, following guidance from medical experts, the Premier League actually tightened up the regulations regarding concussions, urging caution as much as possible, but also adding in these 2 concussion substitutes so that they can be added on top of the normal 3. And so that teams aren't kind of forced into a situation where they have to choose between tactics and concussion substitutes. But what I find quite interesting about the quote from the Premier League is that the IFAB, who oversee the laws of the game, believe that where there is any doubt about a player having been concussed, the players should be protected, being permanently removed from the match. And also the FA had the very kind of popular campaign, if in doubt, sit them out. So is there legitimate criticism maybe from you, Ben, that teams aren't going on by the rules and sitting on the side of caution? Or is it kind of, as Raj has explained there, that in the context of the situation, it's not actually fair for us to give comment on medical teams, and maybe it's the rules that are wrong rather than the medical teams?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult first and foremost because, when we're observing something, some on-pitch activity, we're not privy again to exactly what has happened. Different camera angles, different conversations might give a slight different sort of insight into what had actually happened in the first place. But those guidelines from the FA slightly, and they are guidelines. If in doubt, sit them out. I mean, really, what does that mean? Like, okay, I went on the pitch and he seemed fine, and I was in no doubt, so he continued. Oh, great, yeah. So that covers the problem is, and we've seen this, and there's supposed to be an almost a level playing field here, where the concussion protocols are adhered to worldwide. From UEFA and FIFA and the relevant associations and federations. However, when we're seeing on some of the world's biggest stages, we've seen in the World Cup, where players have been knocked unconscious. And in that, if you look at the guidelines with regards to that, any player that loses consciousness for however long should be removed from the pitch immediately. I think the last World Cup, guy from Morocco, former Watford player, don't recall his name. He was knocked. He was gone. He was not only allowed to continue once he came back around, but then he also played in the follow-up game, which was within that 7-day period, which they say is a minimum of an enhanced care setting. Now, that in itself is fairly ambiguous in terms of an enhanced care setting. There's assumption there that just because you're working with elite level club and with clinicians and practitioners, that your brain somehow miraculously recovers within a quicker time frame. That isn't the case. An injury is an injury is an injury. Doesn't matter where you are. So even those 7-day turnaround protocols are seen by some as being, just a little bit, maybe, the brain hasn't fully recovered. And even this season, we've seen Luke Shaw. What we forget is he suffered, I think it was that first concussion in the Manchester derby. That was before the international break. He suffered a secondary high velocity strike of the ball to the face in his return game. Now that was 14 days later. Fortunately, if that hadn't have been that international break, then in theory he would have been within the protocol to return to play within 7 days. and you could have found yourself in a, in a lot more serious, predicament with regards to, again, that secondary impact.
We've discussed here about the on-field decisions being limited because of time, just the realities of the situation. But another question that I wanted to put to you, and like you said there, Ben, you gave the World Cup example. To my mind, Euro 2020/21, whatever you want to call it, Benjamin Pavard, the kind of differing discussions about was he not unconscious. But the story seemed to be the same, that the pressure was almost on the medical staff to allow him to play on because it was a high pressure game. Do you think that a third party independent doctor is needed in these situations, Raj? Somebody who does not have investment in either club, is just there to protect the players and is not going to be unduly influenced. He's just there for players' health.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially an independent neurologist. And we've seen that, like, for example, in America, NFL has taken that with the independent neurologists making the decisions for players in that regard, and it's led to much better outcomes. I think the most pertinent example that comes to mind for me is the Argentina-Germany World Cup with Christoph Kramer, where he was completely knocked out. The ref asked him, "Do you know where you are?" And he didn't even know. And he was still, and then that's when he got pulled out of the game. And so in that case, yeah, independent neurologists would help significantly, because then they're not under the pressure of whatever it is that country's a federation coming down and say, hey, how come you don't let this guy play, or whatever it is, coaching. And so I think that's such a clear and obvious need when it comes to this aspect, because we know that the risk of allowing a player to play can be significant, like Ben talked about with SIS, secondary impact syndrome. So it's almost to the point where, is it going to take someone almost dying from that for it to happen, right? And so that's what you don't want to see.
I just want to follow on it, and so you're exactly right, and that was, it would be a real move in the right direction. However, you mentioned the Pavard incident. Now, a FIFA protocol had in place where they do send independent doctors to assess the players. Now, Pavard come out and he said, yeah, I was out for around about 15 seconds. And that was clear from the video footage that we actually seen. Now, the independent medical doctors actually assessed Benjamin Pavard days after that event. They cleared him. After consultation with the French Football Federation, and he was allowed to play that next game. Now, again, yeah, look, it's almost, are you playing a lip service? Is this just a ticky box exercise? And ultimately, like Raj says, will it take some kind of significant, injury? I don't want to tempt any fate or wish upon, but for somebody, the authorities, to sort of really stand up and take this, seriously.
And with that kind of independent doctors there, Ben, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but were they pitch side, or was this done independently a few days later, where if they had come onto the pitch, they might have seen him knocked out and gone, actually, this is really dangerous?
This was done away from the stadium. This was done, I think there was protocol maybe to visit the player within maybe a 24 to 72 hour time period, ahead of that next game, just to make sure that any protocol was adhered to. So that was, yeah. And again, it was a question that I did put to Phil Hayward, actually, when we spoke to him at the beginning of the season, and he went, from the video footage, yes, it looked as if he was unconscious, but you can never be 100% certain, and you just have to hope and pray that these federations and associations and those involved aren't putting the players' health at risk, for the for maybe what they see as being the greater good. And
so you're both in agreement then that probably the best thing is a change in rules, because at the moment it just seems a lip service at the moment. I do want to go into one last thing then. You've kind of talked about it there, Raj, the secondary concussion syndrome. We've said that an initial concussion can be quite dangerous, but what makes this bit even more dangerous? It's kind of the fact that it follows on so quickly from another concussion.
Yeah, so after you have a concussion, there's a massive demand for resources in your brain. And so if you add another one on top of that, you're looking at even more, potential significant brain cell death. And that's really the issue there in general. And then I think one thing I want to say about the rules, this goes for all elite sport. If you give a lot of gray area in a rule, the club is going to pick that gray area which benefits them the most. That's just what we know. And so it has to be a hard and fast rule, like Ben talked about. What does doubt mean? I can say, well, yeah, anyone can manipulate that however they feel. So it has to be a rule that is going to be actual, like hard and fast rule.
I just find it quite interesting to me that there is a concussion substitute, so that they're not put at, as the rules say, a numerical disadvantage. Is it purely because they want their best players out there, Ben? Do you think that that is the reason why they're risking it? I mean, to me, it goes back to Raj's wonderful phrase, risk and reward. I would be thinking long term, and also personally, of the player's health. But I'd be thinking this player could be out long term if we risk them by putting them out there, making them continue the game. Why is that not being factored in when teams are making these sorts of decisions?
Money, would be the long and the short of it. Now it's big business. It's very short-termism. Your shelf life as a manager, as a coach, it's a results driven. So of course you want your best players out there performing. You speak to those players on the pitches. We've seen it, the Benjamin Pavard and so on. Those decisions will be player led. What you feel like, how you feeling. I'm fine. I want to go on. Look at the Jan Vertonghen incident, Champions League for Tottenham. There was an incident where he was vomiting by the side of the pitch. He was allowed to continue. It wasn't until around about 9 or 10 months after that event that Jan Vertonghen said, look, for the past sort of 5 or 6 months, I've been really struggling. On the world's biggest stage, you have pressure from stakeholders. You have just pressures of performing, in a stadium full of 80, 90,000 people. Look, that's why it's best, just take them out of that environment. Like Raj says, how can you expect to conduct baseline testing in that type, highly charged, highly pressured environment? I've spoken to, physiotherapists and pitch side doctors who've went on and referees have been sort of standing over them with the watch and almost like, come on, what's happening?
That's outrageous.
Yeah. And it's like, I've been with them 30 seconds. I'm assessing their head injury. Yeah, this game needs to go now. So hurry up and make a decision. And these are conversations, maybe not so much now and maybe not at the highest level in the league, but further down the leagues, in the not so distant past, those conversations were happening and taking place in football.
Just one final question to you, Raj, and maybe Ben, if you want to chime in as well on this. But to me, I'm reasoning this maybe a bit too much, but surely a groggy kind of potentially concussed player will not be good as a substitute. Even if it's Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi, if they're concussed, they're not going to be a useful player. It baffles me why you would be forced to carry on. What are your thoughts on that, Raj?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you would think so, but it's still not as overt, right? When you think someone's groggy, you're like, oh, maybe it'll wear off after a little bit. Whereas if your ankle's broken, you can't play, or whatever it is, right? If you have a muscle pull, you physically cannot play. When you're groggy, you can still potentially get through that and still be, on the pitch and trying to impact the game. And I think that's really is the major difference there. That's why you see guys, sometimes they're allowed to play, like if they even have a mild hamstring pull or muscle pull, they're still allowed to play through the game and risk, because it's not overt enough. It's not severe enough in the moment where it completely eliminates their ability to impact the play. And that's why concussions are so dangerous, because you're still kind of there, but you're not. But whereas underneath everything with a concussion, there's actually more danger going on than you can see above the surface.
I guess any final words on that, Ben?
No, and I don't want to make light of the subject, but I'm talking about this, and actually I had a football anecdote that sprung to mind, and I've heard this on several occasions by different managers, Harry Redknapp, Sam Allardyce being one, and the story goes, and this is about what triggered it was you said, having a player that remains on the pitch and what will they actually be like. So this dates back to, I think it was early 80s, maybe. The Partick Thistle manager was John Lammy. And it was a Scottish League match where the centre forward, Colin McGlashan, suffered a serious clash of heads during the game. Now his assistant manager went on and he assessed the player. And forgive me if you've already heard this story, but he assessed the player and he sort of went back to the line and he said to the manager, he went, hey, Gaffer, he needs to come off. He says, the bloke doesn't know who he is. He says he's took a whack, he's concussed. He says he doesn't know who he went. So John Lammy went, tell him he's Pele and send him back on. I mean, and almost that's what you're dealing with, because football in itself in the sport is very very manly, and players maybe don't like to feel as if they've been beaten or given in or show any sign of weakness. And that's what, the difficulties around, maybe assessing these players when they're going out on the pitch in the medical team. So, thought we'd just, we've went a little bit deeper, thought I'd try and end things on a light-hearted note.
Yeah, it's a light-hearted, but also an incredible kind of insight into what you've described there as almost the identity players have to live up to, this manliness. And it's maybe topics for other days around that kind of perceived working hard, going through these sorts of injuries, even if it is to the detriment of their long-term health. But in terms of it, I hope people have enjoyed it. It is the first one of 2022. It'd be fantastic for you to start off the year with a like, a comment, and a subscribe as well. That would be amazing. Make sure to check out Raj over at 3CB Performance. Make sure to check out the website as well, because we're going to be releasing some articles and some more insights through the year in a written form as well. But for now, I'm going to wish you the best of luck, the best of health, and we will see you again next week.